At the time, there was a journalist around every corner in Lampedusa. One of them happened to be in the cafe, and he noticed that I was worked up about something. He asked me what was the matter, and I told him exactly how I felt. Without missing a beat, he said, Doctor, do you know how many children are just like Mustafa in Favor? How many lose their parents at sea or in their own war-torn countries? How many are still living there in orphanages or in the only building they can find that hasn't yet been bombed? He was not wrong about that. I thought of a story I had seen on RAI 3 on the program Mediterraneo, one of the few that broadcast this kind of content. It was about an orphanage in Homs, the Syrian city devastated by air raids. Almost every day, another child was brought to the orphanage as the only surviving member of his or her family. I had been bowled over by one child who still had the strength to laugh and tell jokes. She looked straight into the camera, proud to be able to count from 1 to 10 in English, a foreign language. She and the other children were being cared for by workers who lived in fear of the increasing likelihood of yet another attack. The journalist was still talking, but I was no longer listening. Then he mentioned a statistic that caught my attention. Do you know how many unaccompanied children and teenagers have arrived in Italy this year? 7,000. Some of them left home alone, and others lost their families along the way. 7,000, an astronomical number, a figure that is hard to visualize and even harder to accept. We have long since lost track of the number of rubber rafts that come in. When we see footage of refugees clambering out of rescue boats, we are no longer surprised. But this number is important. 7,000 children have arrived here and they have lost every point of reference they have ever known. We have to do something about this number. Lampedusa. Winter often brings a strong northwest wind to Lampedusa. The waves leap so high that they spatter over the land like missile, then come crashing down on the rocky coastline. One afternoon many years ago, a freighter was wrecked on the rocks on the north side of the island. The seamen used flares to signal their location, but the rescue boats could not leave the port because the seas were so rough that they would not have been able to reach them. The crew was at the mercy of the tempest and in despair. My father and his friends decided to attempt a rescue. The Kennedy was sturdily built and he was sure they could do it. We all gathered on the cliff top to watch the little fishing boat attempt the impossible. Everyone was terrified for them. My mother clasped my hand in hers. The Kennedy was in sight of the freighter, but could not steer too near, given that it too was at risk of being dashed against the rocks. My father and his friends put down an anchor secured by a steel cable that was connected to a capstan. Then they slowly drew closer to the freighter until they could help the seamen to jump aboard. They were only a few yards from safety, but getting them there was extremely challenging. The Lampedusan fishermen yelled at the top of their lungs, continuously testing their limits. We watched anxiously from above, the whole island waiting with bated breath. More than once we were convinced the freighter and the Kennedy were about to ram each other. Had that happened, none of them would have survived. Despite the extreme risk they were taking, my father and the other fishermen never once considered turning back. When they all arrived back in port, they were greeted like heroes. Even though they were exhausted, that evening we threw a large party for them at our house. The seamen who had been saved could not stop thanking our courageous men who had risked their life and limb for their sake. It was the night between May 7th and May 8th, 2011. To the surprise of nobody, I received a telephone call, this time from the Guardia de Finanza. Dr. Bartalo, we are escorting a barge into port. There are too many people to count. My colleagues and I headed to Favaloro Pier. The barge had been intercepted not far from Lampedusa. At that point in time, the EU search and rescue operation was not yet in place, and so migrants had a long distance to travel before they could be spotted. Still, rescuers from Lampedusa's Port Authority, the Guardia di Finanza, the Carabinieri, the police, and the fire brigade were continually ferrying boatloads of people to the pier. That night it was the Guardia di Finanza's turn. These men do a fantastic job, day in, day out. We imagine working in the uniformed forces must be exciting, and that is often true. But we rarely think about the sacrifices these men have to make being so far from their families. In the Guardia di Finanza's case, they have to be ready to go out to sea at all times, risking their lives to rescue people regardless of the weather conditions. I see them return to port exhausted, having hauled dozens of men, women, and children out of the water without an ounce of energy left in their arms. They often reach a boat just in time to watch it capsize as if in slow motion before their eyes, hurling dozens of refugees into the sea. Or a punctured rubber raft that is rapidly deflating and just about to let its human cargo slip down to their deaths. They have to work quickly, even in strong gales, or it will be too late and there will only be bodies to collect. That night, 2 rescue boats had gone out in bad weather. 2 soldiers had climbed aboard the barge and were steering it toward the port. One of the rescue boats led the way, while the other brought up the rear. Meanwhile, the sea was growing rougher. The passengers numbered a staggering 550. At last, from the pier, we could make out 2 boats coming toward us, but the one carrying the refugees was nowhere in sight. It transpired that the rudder had malfunctioned. Instead of being maneuvered safely into port, the boat was stranded on the rocks just yards from the coast. Within sight of the Porta de Europa sculpture that symbolizes Lampedusa's welcome of refugees. We all hastened there at once, doctors, soldiers, volunteers, journalists, and other Lampedusans who had heard what was happening. It was late at night. The waves smashed violently against the shore. The barge was rocking dangerously, which would make the rescue even harder. Those who could swim jumped into the water to save themselves. We made a long human chain to fetch those who were too afraid to move. I shall never forget the way Memo, who works as a passenger service agent at the airport, leaped unhesitatingly into the sea to pull out one person after another. The wind and the waves gave us no respite, making our every move hazardous and almost impossible. Many of the refugees were women and children, including a 4-month-old Nigerian baby named Severin. We had to take him from the arms of his mother as she was struggling to climb out of the barge. We handed him to a journalist named Elvira, who had put down her pen and notepad to join the chain. Elvira then spent all night trying to relocate the child's mother, who was beside herself and believed her baby was lost. At dawn, Elvira found her and gave Severin back to her. It was an astonishing encounter between 2 very different women, both in tears and united in that moment. For her gesture, Elvira was awarded the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic. I was glad of that. We need symbolic figures like Elvira to make known our cause. We want people to be moved by the migrants' plight, to understand that they are good people who are grateful for our help, especially when they see us ready to give our all to save them. Conversely, they could be bitterly disappointed when we turn them away and make them feel unwanted. It took us 3 hours to rescue those 550 people. Afterward, they were drained, as were we. But although we were dead tired, we had the satisfaction of knowing that we had saved every single one of those lives, or so we thought. Having worked through the night, I went home. Rita made me a cup of hot coffee and stroked my hair. Only a few hours later, I received another telephone call. Dottor, please, we need you to come back to the Porta de Europa. I could not imagine why, as by the time I left, the rescue effort had been completed, and rescuers were surveying the site to understand how the accident had happened. Nevertheless, I dressed and went out. The barge was still rocking, but the sea was a little calmer, and the divers had already been dispatched. 3 bodies lay on the shore. The divers had recovered them from beneath the keel of the boat, running the risk of being crushed themselves. The victims were 3 young boys. We took them to the mortuary by the cemetery. As always, it was my job to examine the corpses. One of them had fractured every single bone in his body from head to toe. I left the cemetery destroyed. I felt as if I had been run over by a tank. That day in the bars and cafes of Lampedusa, people talked of nothing else. The whole island had been mobilized to help with the rescue. We were forlorn and defeated. We did not even know that the worst was still to come. October 3rd, 2013. October 2nd, 2013, a month had passed since my stroke. I was still theoretically convalescent, but a few days after returning home, I was back at work. Some of my facial muscles were still a little stiff. One leg occasionally misbehaved, and a steamy stream of unmentionable words escaped me from time to time. Nonetheless, I was making a good recovery. On my return to Lampedusa before going back to the clinic, I did take some time out to think and reflect. I walked around my island. I needed to smell the sea again, to refill my eyes with beauty, with Lampedusa's unparalleled wildness preserved like a scrap of Eden. I went out on a boat and was charmed by the dolphins darting about me. I met up with my father's old crew and talked with them. They had been my comrades in life and labor for years, and we had spent many a long and tiring day together. That experience had stood me in good stead. Even now that I am in a different profession and our paths have to some extent diverged, Lampedusa is not an easy island to live on. It is a small piece of the earth's crust that broke off from Africa and drifted toward Europe. As such, it is something of a symbolic gateway between the two continents. Its destiny has been shaped by its unusual geographical origins, tectonic movements that determine not only the future of the land but also the fates of its people. The weather was mild on that October night. 2 heavy loads of migrants had just disembarked. All of them were Syrians. Their arrival created difficulties for the Italian administration. The authorities in charge of the reception center had to take the ethnic and religious differences among the migrants into account. The unaccompanied women and children could not be housed together with the men or their nuclear families. This was a serious matter that could not be ignored. And so, early the following morning, the Syrians who arrived on these boats were still standing on the pier, waiting for the administration to work out how best to house them. That was how the saddest day in Lampedusan history began. At 7:30 a.m. on October 3rd, I received a telephone call from the commandant of the port authority. "Doctor, please come to the pier right now. There has been a shipwreck and many have died." "I'm already here, Commandant," I said. "I haven't left. We have only just finished examining the last 2 groups. I'll wait for you here." A quarter of an hour passed and a 21-foot boat pulled into the harbor. It was the Gamar, and it belonged to Vito Fiorino. I know Vito well. He was a fisherman who often took visitors to Lampedusa out with him during the tourist season, just as I had done as a boy on the Pilachira. The night before, Vito had taken 8 people out on the Gamar, and among them was a woman who shares the name of my daughter, Grazia. She often came to Lampedusa at this time of year to visit her sister who runs a shop here. From a distance, I could see that she was crying. They had gone out for a nighttime fishing expedition to Tabakara, a beautiful and unspoiled cove. When it gets dark, the stars in the sky are unforgettable. Tourists usually spend the whole night out there, sleep on the boat, and then come back to harbor for breakfast. Near dawn that morning, one of the men had woken Grazia and said that he could hear voices in the distance. "It sounded like screaming. It's probably seagulls," she has said, "or maybe tourists who are even noisier than we are." Unconvinced, the man had asked Vito to steer the boat in the direction of the sounds he had heard. The closer they got, the clearer and louder the noises became. Gradually, a ghastly scene came into view. The sea was full of people shouting for help and lifeless bodies. There was no sign whatsoever of a boat. The migrants' barge had gone down right by the entrance to the harbor. More than 500 people were panicking just yards from the shore. Some had attempted to swim toward land, some had drowned instantly. Others had been trapped in the hold, never to escape. The current had swept both the living and the dead in the direction of Isola de Conigli. That was where Vito and his guests found them. On the Gomar there was chaos. The passengers leaned out of the boat, trying to haul in as many of the survivors as possible. One of them had thrown himself into the water and was towing struggling refugees back to the Gomar before handing them safely to the others on the board. In 3 hours they saved 49 people, but they could not rescue any more. If they took on any more weight, the Gomar would sink too. When the survivors reached the pier, they were all drenched and covered in diesel. Some of them could be treated immediately. Others had to be sent to the emergency room. Grazia would not stop sobbing. The sea was full of corpses, she said, unable to believe what she had seen. We began to grasp the magnitude of the disaster. Minutes passed. Another fishing boat arrived. Its captain, Domenico, blundered and his boat collided with the pier. We helped the crew to moor it and went aboard. Domenico was trembling. I knew him to be an expert sailor who had faced death many times, and I had never seen him in such a state before. Pietro, he said, nothing like this has ever happened to me. He had 20 survivors with him, all of them extremely unwell. Unlike the Gomar, his boat did not have a ladder to make it easier for survivors to climb aboard. To get the survivors onto the boat, he had the crew grip his legs while he leaned out to heave them up by the arms. Many of them slipped through my fingers because of all the diesel. They might as well have been covered in grease, he said. They went underwater and they never came back up. Pietro, I tried to save them, but I couldn't. It was dreadful. In Domenico's fishing net, there were 4 corpses. I checked them one by one. 3 had been dead for several hours. The 4th was a young girl. Domenico could not stop talking about what he had seen. Pietro, the sea was full of bodies, he said, weeping. Dead bodies floating everywhere, and the ones who were still alive were all clutching at me. I tell you, it was horrific. As he spoke, I held the young woman's wrist between my fingers. Rigor mortis had not yet set in, which could mean that she had died very recently. Then I felt a pulse. Shut up, I said to Domenico. Be quiet. I concentrated hard. That was definitely a heartbeat. It was almost imperceptible, but I had felt it. Then another one. She was not dead. I took her in my arms, and with a superhuman burst of energy, Domenico heaved us both over the side of the boat and onto the pier. We had to hurry. At the clinic, 20 minutes of delirious activity ensued. We undressed her and inserted tubes to suction out the salt water and diesel from her mouth and lungs. The anesthetist and I began to perform CPR. Compress, breathe, ventilate. Compress, breathe, ventilate. We performed one set of compressions after another, adrenaline coursing through our veins. At last, there was a little spike on the monitor. Her heart had started beating again. It began slowly, then grew more regular. It was impossible. It was a miracle. We wept for joy. Cabrat, that was her name, had been successfully resuscitated. We took her to the landing pad in an ambulance. From there, a helicopter took her to Palermo. I had experienced the greatest surge of emotion in my 25 years of first aid work, but there was no time to celebrate. All the uniformed forces on the island had sent motorboats out to the scene of the disaster. Every available piece of equipment and every man on duty was there. I returned to the pier ready to pick up other survivors, but by now only dead bodies were being dropped off. Within just a few hours, we counted 111. Green and black bodies were lined up all along Favallo Pier. I hovered by the first sack for a while and finally opened it. It was a young boy. He was wearing a pair of striking red shorts as if he had dressed up smartly for his first day of a new life. Instead, the Coast Guard had fished him out of the water with their boat hook, a simple tool usually used to latch onto other boats or to retrieve objects that had dropped into the sea. That day, its sole use would be to catch corpses. The body was so perfect that he looked alive. I held him in my arms, shook him gently to wake him, and felt for a pulse. This time, however, there would be no miracle. I began the rest of the inspections, opening the bags one after another. At least 20 of them were clenching crucifixes on chains between their teeth as if their final act were to entrust themselves to God. Since then I have often dreamed of those lips clamped shut around the cross. One woman had given birth. Her umbilical cord was still attached. We put her and her baby in the same coffin together with a teddy bear. Where would we find that many coffins, and where could we put them? Mayor Giuseppe Nicolini was with me on the pier. We ordered freezer chests and caskets and put them all in the airport hangar. We had no other option. 15 days and nights passed this way. The rescue boats went out and brought back corpses. Submarines surveyed the seabed and scoured the wreckage for their bodies of men, women, and children. On the pier and then in the hangar, we tested body parts and bone fragments in order to identify the 368 victims. Forensic scientists were brought in as reinforcements, and they helped us to arrange them in the coffins. There was no way we could have dealt with this distressing task on our own, especially after all we had been through. A team of psychiatrists arrived to work with the survivors and the emergency workers who had been involved in the rescue. They began with the divers, who were suffering the greatest trauma. They had to cope with finding the people who had been trapped inside the barge, coming face to face with scores of lifeless little boys and girls. I, too, would have been benefited from some psychological support, but it was not available to me. I was hurting and felt alone, but I could not allow myself to fall apart. There was still too much to do. The sight of the 368 body bags lined up in the hangar was heart-wrenching, but having to put the bodies in coffins and steal them was even worse. Afterward, the mayor, the parish priest, and I made an unanticipated decision. We sent several buses to the reception center to pick up survivors so that they could say goodbye to their friends and relatives they had lost. When they arrived, they sobbed quietly. Each one of them mourned in front of a coffin. It did not matter to them which one. Then someone began to wail. For just one moment, tragedy echoed in that enormous makeshift cemetery. We all woke from a kind of slumber then. The world we were living in was far too real, and only now were we beginning to see it clearly. In the days that followed, the torment continued. Many Lampedusians made the decision to allow the bodies of the victims to rest alongside those of their loved ones in the cemetery. At the pier, refugees prostrated themselves on the coffins of their mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters, trying to stop the cranes from lifting them onto boats that would ship them off for burial in Sicily. Relatives arrived from all over Europe begging to be allowed to take a photograph by the numbered labels of the coffins in which their family members' bodies lay. Faced with this unprecedented emergency, Lampedusa needed every ounce of energy it had. The island responded with a marathon outburst of solidarity. An extraordinary number of families opened their homes to the survivors and took care of them, but we were also dealing with an unresponsive bureaucracy. At the commune, the mayor kept calling for greater public awareness of the situation on the island and requesting more help, as did I at the clinic. For months, I could think of little else. We all knew that October 3rd had changed our lives. The following year, the anniversary of the disaster was observed, not without public debate and controversy. It was a deeply emotional occasion. Many of the survivors who had since made their way to join relatives and friends all over Europe flew back to Lampedusa to attend. The locals who had hosted and taken care of them welcomed them at the airport. There was hugging and crying. It was a liberating moment, but not for everyone. I stood in a corner watching the automatic door of the arrivals hall open and close. I watched the migrants run to the families who had briefly adopted them in the days following the shipwreck. Every time the door opened, my hope ebbed a little. When the last of the survivors left the terminal, I knew that my wish had not been granted. Cabrat had not come back. I would not be able to hold in my arms the girl we had plucked from the jaws of death. Perhaps she had not wanted to relive her suffering and had preferred to stay in Sweden. I felt a wave of sadness that I made my way through the dozens of film crews and reporters' microphones and went home alone.